Linda Hoffman-Pugh spent 8 hours in front of a Boulder County grand jury in January of 1999. She was an important witness because as the housekeeper, she knew a lot about the day-to-day life in the Ramsey household.
What other witnesses had to say?
Yes, to look in the mirror and not be able to look in the mirror.
And started work in October. But as soon as the grand jury was ready to disband, Foxes have complained that this case hasn't been able to go to the next step, the next level, move away from them as suspects to intruders. And I'll say this to the Ramseys, until they produce...
I think it was an accident, and then it just continued from there.
Federal Judge Wiley Daniels said the former housekeeper's First Amendment rights would be violated if she were silenced by grand jury secrecy laws. Now, Hoffman-Pugh plans to write a book about her experiences, and now anyone who testified before the Ramsey grand jury can talk about it.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Doesn't it feel like the Ramsey housekeeper had a disproportionate role in this case? Such a big role that even the Ramseys, Patsy in particular, identified Linda Hoffman-Pugh as her number one go-to suspect. And of course, that was the first port of call for Detective Patterson. That was the first person that Detective Patterson went to, was Linda Hoffman-Pugh.
I think that maybe Patsy had multiple personalities. I saw that in her one day, and I think that she may have gotten upset with John Bonet for some reason.
Did you know the very first suspect interviewed at her home that same night, the night of December 26th, even before John Bonet's little body had been lifted from the living room carpet and removed from that enormous house on Baseline Road? Well, that was Linda Hoffman-Pugh. The housekeeper even gave handwriting samples, specific samples of specific words in the ransom note 2 days before Patsy and John did. And that first sample that Patsy gave was regarded as useless because Patsy was so emotional, so heavily sedated. And even though Patsy started offering her handwriting, Patsy couldn't complete the process. According to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, late on Saturday evening, December 28th, DA Alex Hunter, who was still in Hawaii, called Bill Wise. He learned that the police had not only asked a heavily sedated Patsy Ramsey for a handwriting sample earlier that same day, they had asked her to copy out parts of the ransom note. But she had become hysterical and could not complete it. And this led to the cops asking Patsy to submit another sample on January 4th, and then another and another. But when all was said and done, almost 3 years later, on October 17th, 1999, the Denver Post published the following story with this headline: "No indictment, experts, conviction a long shot." Well, obviously, if you believe there was no indictment, if you were misled into believing that there were no indictments, obviously you would be misled into thinking that a conviction would be a long shot as well. How can you get a conviction without getting an indictment?
We talked with Lynn Wood, the Ramsey's attorney, who says he's happy about this ruling. He has another spin on it, though. He says that the truth will come out about the grand jury, that it didn't have enough evidence to indict his clients.
But one wonders how that story in the Denver Post should have been worded differently had the world known then and there that far from being no indictments, there were actually 4 indictments, 2 apiece. Would they still have assumed the conviction would be a long shot if they knew that? And make no mistake, as late as October 1999, the evidence making the headlines and occupying the minds of media and folks following the case who were sort of confounded by this result or lack of a result, a lot of the speculation and chatter going on in real time had to do with still analyzing the handwriting of the ransom note. This is an extract from that article. It was penmanship versus panties. The most damaging information against any one suspect was the handwriting analysis that concluded John Bonet's mother, Patsy Ramsey, may have written the ransom note found in the family's Boulder home. After comparing one of those 4 or 5 handwriting samples, the one from the left hand to the ransom note, Chet Ubowski of the CBI concluded this handwriting showed indications that the writer was Patsy Ramsey. Referring to the then unknown testimony from opposing experts, the Denver Post assumed it might not be so important. Again, this was based on the assumption of no indictments. Still, handwriting analysis can make for dicey testimony in court. In the Oklahoma City bomb trial of Terry Nichols, U.S. District Judge Richard Match scaled back prosecution attempts to include much handwriting analysis after defense lawyers called it junk science. Prosecutors ought to think twice about whether you're going to offer these conclusions about handwriting in court, the judge said, adding that there is no academy of training for these people. Meanwhile, other physical evidence pointing to the Ramsey mother includes fiber found on the duct tape that covered the dead girl's mouth. That was on the inside. The fiber matched a sweater Patsy wore Christmas night, the day before her daughter's body was found, law enforcement sources said. Patsy turned the sweater over to police more than a year later, and the paintbrush handle used in the garrote that helped strangle JonBenet came from Patsy's art set. But I think the handwriting in the ransom note was important, and I think it was so important that's really how and why the jurors voted the way they did. And I think they recognized its importance as well. And they didn't vote the way they did because they were convinced that an intruder wrote the ransom note, or because Lou Smith, John Douglas, and Team Ramsey, their numerous handwriting experts, well, they collectively failed to convince the grand jury that an intruder wrote the note, didn't they? Also, how could there be an intruder if Patsy wrote the note? Now, I don't think it came down to the handwriting experts anyway. I don't think whatever it was that convinced the grand jury one way or the other was due to the work, the arguments of the handwriting experts. It was due to someone else. It was due to something else. But what?
Which brings us at last to the moment of truth.
If handwriting experts didn't convince the grand jury who wrote the ransom note, who did?
Are you sure you want to hear this?
But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, someone was saying on their mobile phones they can't find, where is the thanks button? They can't find it. Well, it is slightly difficult. You need to scroll one screen, I guess, to the right. And there it is. It's sort of a dollar within a heart-shaped icon. If you've never actually used the thanks button, this is your chance, especially if you're appreciating the content that we putting up for you, putting out there for you. It takes quite a lot of effort to research. So if you're finding this analysis, please do hit the thanks button, and let's continue.
This is what the grand jury wanted to know. They wanted to find out about JonBenet's relationship with her mother, about her bedwetting. They wanted to know about a Swiss Army knife found near JonBenet's body, which came from a hiding place. Hoffman-Pugh told them about a blanket which was wrapped around JonBenet when she was found in the basement, a blanket which would have come from a tiny upstairs dryer. This is information, Hoffman-Pugh says, only.
Over the past few episodes, I've tried to demonstrate not only how one after the next expert witness for the prosecution was discredited, dismissed, or simply not particularly compelling in terms of saying Patsy was the author of the ransom note, but that probably if you heard the technical arguments for and against Patsy being the author by these experts, you'd probably not be convinced either way anyway. And yet something, or rather someone, seemed to have convinced them, seemed to have convinced the grand jury. Who? And to reiterate, if handwriting experts didn't convince the grand jury, couldn't convince the grand jury who wrote the ransom note, who did? Well, what about the housekeeper? Now let me ask you, do you think of the Ramsey housekeeper as a peripheral figure? I don't. I think of her as a central character, a principal character, but what's interesting is that over time the housekeeper has receded further and further and further from the center of the story, hasn't she? With every successive interview that John gives and every successive documentary that comes out, the housekeeper sort of faded away, faded from view, faded in prominence. Do you agree? Because although she wanted to write a book, ultimately she wasn't allowed to. The whole legal apparatus around this basically seemed to change their minds ultimately. And then Linda Hoffman-Pugh even stopped giving interviews, and she ultimately lost her legal battle against the Ramseys. And so her narrative has become peripheral. Do you agree? Over time, the housekeeper has become a peripheral figure when she shouldn't be. That's why I think it was the housekeeper that changed the grand jury's mind, because she had such a important and powerful and authoritative place in the story, originally, right? And it may not be that she changed the grand jury's mind, it may be that she simply helped them make up their minds, specifically on who authored the ransom note, but not just that, on other things as well. And no, it wasn't Linda Hoffman-Pugh's expert knowledge of handwriting that was decisive. She didn't need to be a handwriting expert or linguist. Instead, it was her informal but accessible, her casual, everyday knowledge of Patsy, her intimate portrait of Patsy, that gave the jury those sparkling insights that were so necessary in this case, those scintillating insights that they were looking for. And remember, even if you were examining the handwriting, you're having experts examining it, because the handwriting is disguised, handwriting analysis alone isn't going to reveal the author, certainly not with absolute certainty. And because of this, the character of the handwriting needs to be matched to a character, a person. And that was where Professor Foster's work was quite valuable, wasn't it? But arguably, the housekeeper did the same thing Professor Foster did, perhaps even better. It was all about recognizing the author through their aphorisms, through their expressions, through their habits, through their personality. And if there's one thing Patsy Ramsey contributes to this case, it's a surfeit of personality. I don't think there's any argument with that. And that means doing something that is hard to do. You need to get to know the person, not just the idiosyncrasies of their handwriting, right? The likes and dislikes, but the private life of this person. And the crazy thing is, the housekeeper could sort of offer both insights into the handwriting and the personality of this person as a layperson. Even some of the most random throwaway comments made by the Ramsey housekeeper provided penetrating insights, like this one. I also told the grand jury that while Patsy could be kind and even thoughtful, she was one of the strangest people I have ever met. And that's an excerpt from an unpublished draft of the housekeeper's book, Someone is Getting Away with Murder. That's by Linda Hoffman-Pugh. Now, some people might say the same thing about the ransom note, that it was kind and thoughtful in parts. Remember, there's a reference to, we respect your business. Also, I advise you to be well rested. But it's also one of the strangest ransom notes anyone had ever seen. And then the housekeeper tries to explain what she means. Patsy's strange. Strange how? Right, so she says, Patsy was one of the strangest people I've ever met. By way of example, I told the grand jury that while cleaning out and organizing her vast number of purses, one of my tasks every Friday, Patsy took me aside and explained that she had gone to a local church, had members of her congregation pray over her, and the next day she found that the doctors had declared her miraculously cured of stage 4 ovarian cancer. But that wasn't all. Patsy also had visions. Patsy confided in me that John's deceased daughter from his first marriage appeared before her to tell her that an angel was coming to cure her of cancer. Patsy believed her dead stepdaughter's message was true and that the angel sent her cancer into remission, along with the help of the parishioners of her church who had prayed over her. But that still wasn't all. One of the ways in which Patsy Ramsey would communicate with me was through handwritten notes. Well, now we are talking. Which she would leave for me with instructions for various duties around the house that needed my attention. Now, I know what you're thinking. So Patsy left handwritten notes, so what? Well, that's like saying, so someone left a ransom note, so what? No, this wasn't any ordinary ransom note. This was a bizarre 3-page ransom note. Not a little bizarre, very bizarre. It's very bizarre and very long. In the same way, Patsy was a bizarre lady. In some ways, you might say, not a little bizarre, very bizarre. Raising her daughter the way she did, was that a little bit bizarre or very bizarre? Trying to turn a little girl into a beauty queen at the age that she was, wasn't that a little bit strange? And the other thing is, Patsy didn't leave the odd post-it here and there. She seemed to leave a snowstorm of them, by the sounds of it, over the period Linda Hoffman-Pugh was employed by the Ramseys. She goes on to write the following. One of the ways in which Patsy Ramsey would communicate with me was through handwritten notes. In the 14-month period that I worked for the Ramseys, that's longer than a year, I was left several dozen handwritten notes by Patsy Ramsey, so I'm quite familiar with her handwriting, and I believe I can recognize it with very little difficulty. I told the grand jury that since leaving the employ of the Ramseys, I had had occasion to see a copy of the ransom note found at the scene of John Bonet's murder. It was heartbreaking for me to admit that the handwriting in the ransom note looked very much like the handwriting Patsy Ramsey used in writing her notes to me. That's pretty personal. That's pretty specific. She doesn't say it looked a little bit like it or it looked somewhat like it. It looked very much like Patsy's handwriting. By way of example, Patsy made her letter A's very distinctively, and she would use accents over words like John Bonet and attaché, and often used initialing of words in combination to name just a few of her many handwriting characteristics. Because I once felt very close to Patsy Ramsey and regarded her with almost as much affection as a member of my own immediate family, it has been hard for me to admit that I am now certain that the handwriting in the ransom note looks to me like it was made by one and the same person, Patsy Ramsey. So what is she expressing through that certainty, the thing that Chatubowski was sort of missing, where he said we can't exclude her? Well, the housekeeper is including her, not with expertise, but just with that sort of common touch. Just in a casual sense, that looks like her handwriting. Now, for a lay person, this is an incredibly prescient piece of analysis, especially the bit about attaché and John Bonet. But wait, there's more. The handwriting and language of the note were all yours, Patsy. Patsy, I can hear your voice in the note. The word hence, for example, was in your Christmas cards and letters, and a word you like to use in conversation. So the word hence was something that Patsy had possibly even used with the housekeeper directly. The phrase, use that good southern common sense, is what you kidded John about, something the housekeeper may have overheard from time to time. And that was because John was anything but southern, having been born and raised in Michigan. The phrase fat cat is what your mother, Nidra, used to call you after you and John became rich. Now, I know what you're thinking. You might say, if the housekeeper knew about these sayings, maybe the housekeeper wrote the note trying to implicate Patsy. And that wouldn't be a really bad argument, except the handwriting doesn't implicate the housekeeper, and also the housekeeper had an alibi, her husband. Also, John Bonet was ultimately found in the Ramsey's home, not the housekeeper's home. Linda Hoffman-Pugh goes on to write, the ransom demand asked that the money be put in an attaché with a proper accent mark over the last E in attaché. That's the part that really stands out to the housekeeper. She says, I remember how carefully you always were to put the proper accent mark over the E in the second syllable of John Bonet's name. The ransom note even ended with the initials SBTC. Do you remember, Patsy, how fond you were of using initials as abbreviations for all sorts of expressions? And you can see where Patsy uses this accent on John Bonet, for example, in her entry forms for John Bonet's pageants. You can see that in terms of the handwriting there. Because, by the way, the word John Bonet doesn't actually appear in the ransom note, ironically enough. But that comes back to our question. If handwriting experts didn't convince the grand jury who wrote the ransom note, who did? Well, what do you think about this idea? What about the housekeeper? Do you think that that's fair? Do you think that that's true? If you heard this testimony, she's written it down, from the housekeeper, what do you think? Would it convince you? Don't you think it convinced the grand jury? I mean, it totally convinced Detective Steve Thomas. Well, there's still a lot to say about the housekeeper, and I think we'll leave that for part 2 in this analysis, where we'll come back to some of the statements she wrote and how it has a bearing on the ransom note specifically. Again, if you're enjoying this analysis, please do hit the thanks button. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.